The Spicer system offers you the only complete system of drivetrain componentry: axle, driveline, transmission, and clutch. The Spicer system is more than hardware. It's specking, technical help, part support, and customized training, because knowledge is part of the package. Spicer training is state-of-the-art. It gives you the competitive edge in specking, maintenance, and operation of vehicles with the Spicer system. And now it's even easier to contact us with the Spicer toll-free number, 1-800-666-8688. This coast-to-coast communication link provides you with a direct source for sales support, technical support, and part support on all Spicer drivetrain components and systems. In this video, you will see the recommended procedure for tearing down and rebuilding Spicer's 1372 and 9072 transmissions. We'll demonstrate most of the techniques on a new style 1372 model built after January 1986. Always remember to use the proper tools, and for your safety, wear protective glasses. This tag located on the rear of the transmission tells you what model transmission you have. It is very important to obtain the bill of material number from this tag when ordering parts. To begin the teardown, first remove the shifter housing bolts. This tag identifies this as a positive stop shift cover, which is found on new style 1372s and on 9072s. Next, draw the cover from the transmission by tightening bolts placed in the two puller holes. Then lift the shifter housing off the case. If it sticks, give it a tap with a rubber mallet or chisel. That will break the seal. Notice that the positive stop cover doesn't have holes in the forward boss, unlike the cover found on 1372s built before 1986. To begin disassembling the positive stop cover, place the gears in neutral and remove the oil trough. Make sure you follow the next steps closely. To avoid damaging the interlocks, you have to tear down this cover as you're about to see it. Loosen the screw in the 6th/7th shift bracket and rotate the fork about 90 degrees from vertical. This depresses the interlocks and keeps them from being damaged. Loosen the screw in the fork and tap the rod out of the housing. If you note which way the forks bend, it will be easier to reassemble them. The shift rod contains an interlock pin, and inside the shift bracket is a poppet ball, spring, and plunger. There is an interlock in the rear boss. It's located between the 4th, 5th, and the 6th, 7th rods. Remove it. Next, loosen the 4th, 5th fork screw, then tap the rod out of the cover. Don't lose the interlock pin in the shift rod. Also, remember to remove the interlock from the housing. By keeping each fork assembly grouped together, you'll avoid mixing up parts during reassembly. The 2nd, 3rd bracket and the fork assembly is removed next. Also, remove the interlock in the rear boss. If you're working on a 9072, this bracket's on the 4th, 5th rod. The first reverse fork and assembly is removed last. Rotate the rod 90 degrees from vertical and remove it. By rotating the rod, you'll avoid damaging the spring in the bracket. Remove the interlock, plunger, and spring from the cover. Check the poppet and interlock holes for chipping or elongation. Now is also the time to check for worn or chipped detents, worn or bent forks, and worn fork pads. Replace any worn components at this time. When you're ready to begin installation, drop the spring into the cover. Install the plunger next, with the flat side placed next to the spring. You have to insert the spring and plunger now because there's not enough room to do it once the shift rods are in place. Lube the first reverse shift rod and install it. The detent should face toward the second third shift fork assembly. This will prevent damage to the spring in the bracket. Finish tapping the rod in place with a rubber mallet. Then install the fork and bracket set screws. Torque them to 40 to 50 foot-pounds. The forks and brackets should move freely on the rods. If they don't, check the rod for burrs and remove them. Next, install the interlock. It will go between the first reverse rod and the second third rod. The round portion should face the first reverse shift rod. Now install the interlock pin in the second third rod. The shoulder or wider end should be on top. Start the rod through the housing. Then install the bracket and fork with the set screw hole facing the front of the case. Make sure the rod and fork set screw holes are aligned. If you don't, you'll damage the rod and the transmission won't shift right. Finally, install the bracket. Torque the set screw to 40 to 50 foot-pounds. Remember to put the interlock into the housing. The rounded end should face the 4th, 5th shift rod. Also, place an interlock between the 4th, 5th and the 6th, 7th rod now. The round part should face the 4th, 5th rod. Continue by installing the 4th, 5th fork assembly. Again, make sure the fork and bracket holes line up with the holes in the rod. The detents should face the 6th, 7th rod. If you're working on a 9072, install the bracket. To reassemble the bracket, install the plunger first. Follow it with the ball, the spring, and finally, the pin. Place a wedge in the cover hole to depress the spring and plunger. This makes it easier to install the shift rod. Place the interlock pin in the 6th, 7th rod, then install it. Place the bracket on the shift rod. Make sure the rod detent is down. Otherwise, the interlock can pop into the interlock hole and freeze up. Place the fork upright with the set screw hole facing the rear of the case. Line up the bracket and fork holes with the holes in the rod and insert the set screws. Torque them to 40 to 50 foot-pounds. Install the oil trough next. The positive stop shift cover is reassembled. To see if the interlocks are working properly, shift one fork in gear with a screwdriver. None of the other forks will shift if everything was reassembled correctly. If you have a 1372 transmission built before 1986, you have an early style cover like this. To begin tearing it down, first remove the set screws. On this type cover, you can remove the rods in any order. We're removing the 6th, 7th rod for this demonstration. All the rods are removed in this way. There is a ball and spring under each rod. Be careful that the spring doesn't fly out of the case. Inspect it for wear and replace it if necessary. There's an interlock between each shift rod in the front of this housing. Once all the rods have been removed, check components for wear. The spring in the 6th, 7th bracket should be checked also. This one is okay. If the spring needs to be replaced, remove the snap ring. The detent plunger and spring come out easily. To reassemble the bracket, put your new spring on the plunger, place them in the bracket, and secure them with the snap ring. Once all reusable parts have been cleaned, start reassembly. Place an interlock in the boss, then drop the poppet ball and spring in the front boss. Because the ball sticks up, it will be hard to install the rod unless you use a wedge. Remember to insert the pin and lube all rods before installation. Tap the rod through the housing. We're installing the 6th, 7th rod here. The detents on all rods should face down toward the cover to prevent lockup and damage to the interlocks. As you continue, line up the fork and bracket set screw holes with those in the rod. If you don't, you'll damage the rod. This can cause hard shifting. Insert the set screws and torque them to 40 to 50 foot-pounds. The shift rods are all in place now. To complete the assembly, install the oil trough. The early style cover is assembled. Again, make sure the interlocks are working correctly. With all forks in neutral, use a screwdriver to shift one of the forks into gear. No other forks should be able to move if the interlocks are working correctly. That completes teardown and reassembly of both the positive stop and the early style 1372 shift covers. Next, we'll begin tearing down the transmission. Begin this teardown by placing the transmission in 2 gears at once. This will keep the yoke from spinning while you remove it. Next, remove the output bearing cap and gasket. Both countershaft caps and idler covers are removed next. After the caps are removed, take the upper reverse idler shaft out of the case. Insert a bolt into the shaft and pry it out, or use a slide hammer. Be sure not to lose the lock ball. Next, push the upper reverse idler gear to the side of the case. Remove the 4 retaining bolts from the input bearing cap. Screw 2 of the retaining bolts into the tap puller holes. Tightening them will let you draw the shaft and cap from the case. Then remove the gasket. This input shaft is found on 9072s and on 1372s made after January 1986. The early model 1372s have this type input shaft. We'll tear down both types of shafts in this program. Remove the clutch housing next. It's heavy, so hook it up to a chain hoist first. Then remove the retaining bolts. Use a rubber mallet to tap the housing away from the case if it sticks. On this model, Snap rings hold the countershaft gears on. Whenever you have a snap ring on the front of the countershaft, you'll have a snap ring on the back of the countershaft too. Notice that the left countershaft drives an oil cooler and the right one drives a power takeoff. This model was built before January 1986. Bolts and washers retain the countershaft gears. There is a snap ring groove on the rear of one of the countershafts, but no snap ring is used there. On the newer 1372 model, take the snap rings off the shaft. Use a large puller to remove the countershaft gears. They're pressed on tight, so it will take a little time to draw them off the shaft. Don't use heat. Heat makes gears soft or brittle. Notice that on the newer 1372s, there is no bearing retainer plate behind the gears. The countershafts are held in place by snap rings on the outer diameters of the rear countershaft bearings. Next, remove both countershaft keys. This is an early style 1372. To remove these countershaft gears, first remove the bolts and washers that hold them on the shaft. Then draw the gears off with a large puller. The keys should be removed next. Notice that on this transmission, there are bearing retainer plates behind each gear. There are none on the new style 1372s. Somehow mark the plates to indicate left and right, then remove them. Whether you have the early style or the new style transmission, teardown is the same for both of them now. On any model, continue by removing the 6th, 7th clutch collar. Next, support the main shaft with a sling. Use a puller that fits the snap ring groove to pull the output bearing from the case. Place the first reverse collar into reverse gear. Then remove the main shaft snap ring and the internally splined thrust washer. Continue by removing the gear bore snap ring and an externally and internally splined thrust washer. There are 2 snap rings and 3 thrust washers altogether. Before going any further, slide reverse gear and the clutch collar against first gear and secure them with a tie wire. You have to do this to get enough clearance for main shaft removal. The clutch collar under reverse gear should remain with reverse gear. Next, remove the rear countershaft snap rings if you're working on a newer model 1372. Then remove the front countershaft bearings. You should replace any bearings that you removed during a rebuild. Move the countershafts to the rear of the case as far as possible. Remove the rear countershaft bearings at this time. Once all the bearings have been removed, move the countershafts forward and toward the side of the case as far as possible. Move the main shaft to the rear of the transmission. Then, keeping the tail low and the nose high, lift it from the case with the help of a hoist. Remove the upper reverse idler gear from the case. Inside this gear are 2 bearings and either a spacer or coil spring. Now you can remove the lower reverse idler shaft and gear. Again, the idler gear contains 2 bearings and a spacer or spring, which should be checked for excessive wear. Finally, pull the countershafts out of the case. The right side or passenger side countershaft must be removed first. Otherwise, there's not enough room to lift the left side countershaft out of the case. The case is completely disassembled. Next, you'll see the correct way to tear down and rebuild the main shaft. Cut the tie wire and remove reverse gear. Then, set the shaft on end in a vise with 6th gear up. Remove the snap ring from the shaft. 6th speed gear can be lifted off. 2 thrust washers and a snap ring are inside the gear. Continue the teardown by taking 5th gear off the shaft and removing the thrust washers. Next, remove the main shaft snap ring. Pull off the 4th/5th clutch collar. Remove the next snap ring and 4th gear. Again, this gear has 2 thrust washers and a snap ring inside. 3rd gear is removed next, along with the thrust washers. Take the snap ring off the shaft. Once the 2nd/3rd clutch collar is lifted off, remove the next snap ring. Second gear can be removed now. Two thrust washers and a snap ring are inside this gear. Lift first gear off the main shaft. Then continue disassembly by removing the thrust washers, a snap ring, and the first reverse clutch collar. Then remove the last snap ring on the shaft. The final step is to remove the pocket bearing from the main shaft with a slide hammer. Main shaft disassembly is now complete. You should clean all the reusable parts, including the case, before reassembly. Check the shaft for worn gear locks, cracks, and signs of twisting. Check gears and clutch collar teeth for cracks and chipped or worn teeth. Examine gear thrust surfaces for heat checks, blue color from excessive heat, and any signs of wear. If you replace a main shaft gear because of tooth damage, you should also replace any mating countershaft gears. Snap rings should always be replaced during a rebuild, and thrust washers should be checked for cracks and wear. If you can feel a ridge on the thrust washer, replace it. Reassembly begins by installing the pocket bearing. The part number must be face up. Place the shaft on end and lubricate it. all parts should be lubricated before assembly. Install the snap ring on the bottom main shaft groove. Then install the first reverse clutch collar, then install the next snap ring. Next, place the two lubricated thrust washers on the shaft. The thrust washer that's seated next to the snap ring is internally splined. Make sure the gear splines are clean, then continue reassembly by sliding first gear into place. The thrust surface should face up and should be lubricated. Second gear goes on the shaft next. The thrust face should ride against first gear. Lube, then install the externally and internally splined thrust washers. Install the next snap ring on the main shaft. Next, the shift collar is installed. Again, don't forget to lubricate the components. This helps protect them from a dry startup. Install the next snap ring on the main shaft. Internally splined washers go next to snap rings on the main shaft. Externally splined washers go next to snap rings found inside the gear bore. Install the third speed gear. The thrust surface should face up. When you install fourth gear, the thrust face should go down toward third gear. Place the thrust washers on next. There are diagrams in the service manual to help you remember which way the thrust washers go. After installing the main shaft snap ring, lube the 4/5 clutch collar. Place it on the shaft. Continue by installing the snap ring and the thrust washers. Fifth gear is placed on the shaft next. Remember to lube the thrust surface, which faces up. Sixth gear can then be installed. Reassembly continues with the installation of two thrust washers, which should be lubricated, and a snap ring. Remember, when you're reassembling the main shaft, internally splined thrust washers are installed next to snap rings on the shaft. Externally splined thrust washers rest next to snap rings inside the gears. Finally, install reverse gear on the shaft with the thrust surface facing first gear. Slide it over the shift collar, then butt first and reverse gears and tie wire them together. This will make it easier to install the shaft into the case. That completes reassembly of the main shaft. Next, the countershaft will be torn down. The countershaft gears are pressed onto the shaft. Notice that the 1372 has exterior head-end gears. All the 9072 countershaft gears are inside the case. This is the main difference between the two transmissions. So to begin disassembly of the 1372 countershaft, place it into a press. Take the gears off one at a time, beginning with sixth gear. There's a key securing each gear. Remove them as disassembly continues. You should use a shield when pressing gears off the shaft. It's also a good idea to note which way the hubs are facing, so you know how the shaft should be reassembled. When the shaft is disassembled, you can see that first gear is part of the shaft itself. Check the gears for wear, cracks, and signs of heat damage. Look for wear on the keys and keyways. And always replace bearings during a rebuild. After cleaning any reusable parts, lube all gear hubs and the shaft. Place all keys in the shaft. Then begin reassembly by aligning the keyway in second gear with the key in the countershaft. Then press the gear on the shaft. You know the gear is seated when the press pressure gauge reads above 10 tons. Continue to press the gears on, one at a time. Countershaft reassembly is complete with the installation of sixth gear. Next, we're going to tear down the new style input shaft. If you are working on a newer 1372 or a 9072, this is the input gear you have. You can begin by removing the snap ring first. The gear slides off the shaft. It should be replaced if there are any signs of damage. There's a snap ring inside here. To get this bearing cap off, you must first expand the snap ring. While the ring is expanded, press the shaft through the cap. A bearing and snap ring remain on the shaft. Carefully remove the snap ring and place the shaft into a press. Press the bearing off. Check the shaft for spline wear. And if needed, replace the snap ring in the cap. Reassembly begins by pressing the shaft into the bearing. Make sure it's properly seated. Reinstall the snap ring next. Continue by expanding the bearing cap snap ring and pressing the shaft assembly through the cap. When the cap is in place, release the snap ring. Make sure it's seated properly in the bearing snap ring groove. Once that is done, place the gear on the shaft. Secure it with a new snap ring. The early style 1372 input shaft is torn down by first removing the snap ring, then pressing the shaft through the bearing. The input gear is part of the shaft and does not come off. To reassemble the unit, press the bearing onto the shaft until it's butted up against the gear and secure it with a snap ring. That completes teardown and rebuild of all the sub-assemblies contained in the Spicer 1372 transmission. Now it's time to put everything back in the case. The left side countershaft must be installed first. To install the right side, push the end in the case as far as possible. Swing it into position and move it toward the front of the case. Be careful not to cut yourself on the keyway. If you install timing blocks in the front and rear, it will be easier to set the shafts in time. The blocks will also make it easier for you to install the main shaft later. Align the countershaft timing marks toward the center of the case. Spicer puts dots at the valleys between the teeth to help you. Here we've painted them to make them more visible. Next, place the bearings and spacer or spring in the reverse idler gear. Place the gear in the case. Tap the idler shaft into place. It must be in line with the gear. If the shaft resists being tapped in the case, they probably aren't aligned, which can damage the bearings or gear. Put the bearings and spring into the upper reverse idler gear. Then place it in the case, making sure it's as far out of the way as possible. Spread the countershafts, then lower the main shaft into the case. Keep the lock wire on first and reverse gears on top so you can cut it later. Installation is easiest if you keep the tail low and the nose high, as you see here. There are two marked 6th gear teeth which are going to line up with the countershafts. Cut the tie wire and move reverse gear toward the rear. Continue reassembly by installing the gear bore snap ring and the internally and externally splined thrust washers. Install the next gear bore snap ring. The internally splined thrust washer and the final snap ring are assembled on the main shaft. Once that is completed, move the main shaft rearward. Lube, then install a new output bearing using a rubber mallet. Make sure it's seated properly. At this time, take the shift collar out of reverse gear if it hasn't come out already. It's a good idea to insert a screwdriver in the case to hold the upper reverse idler gear out of your way. Next, set the countershafts in time with the main shaft. Moving one countershaft at a time is the easiest way to do this. Support the countershaft with a hoist, then remove the alignment blocks. Next, lube one of the input or front countershaft bearings and install it. Check periodically to make sure the countershaft and main shaft are still in time. Also, make sure you use a suitable driver. This will help avoid bearing damage. Working with the same countershaft, install the output or rear countershaft bearing now. This will lock the countershaft in time. The bearing is seated properly when it clears the snap ring groove. Supporting the other countershaft with a hoist, remove the alignment blocks and install the countershaft bearings. Again, check periodically to make sure the countershaft is in time. Install the snap rings on the rear of the countershaft. If you have a new style 1372, reinstall the keys on the countershafts next. Continue by placing the gear on the countershaft. The longer rounded hub should be next to the case. Start the gear on with a rubber mallet if necessary. Place two clutch housing retaining bolts through the gears and threaded holes in the case. Place lubed washers under them to help prevent damaging the bolts. Using the alternating method, draw the gear onto the shaft until it's seated behind the snap ring groove. Once the gears are in place, remove the bolts you used to draw them on with. Then continue reassembly by installing the snap rings. The 6th, 7th clutch collar should be installed next. The collar is marked front and will only go on one way. Next, apply a light coat of Loctite 515 to the clutch housing. Attach the housing to the case and secure it with the cap screws. Torque the smaller bolts to 60 to 80 foot-pounds and the larger bolts to 120 to 150 foot-pounds. Apply moly lube to the main shaft pocket bearing. Then place the shaft assembly and gasket in the clutch housing. You may need to lift the main shaft slightly to align the input shaft pocket bearing with the pilot on the main shaft. The bearing cap must line up with the clutch housing oil hole. Once it's installed, carefully torque the cap screws to only 25 to 32 foot-pounds. If you have an early style 1372, here is the procedure for installing the countershaft gears and input shaft. First, Install the bearing retainer plates. A key must be installed on each countershaft next. Draw the countershaft gears onto the shafts using a big bolt and washer. Secure each gear with a bolt and washer. Make sure the 6th, 7th clutch collar is in place. After applying a gasket eliminator sealant to the clutch housing, attach the housing to the case using a hoist for support. Secure the assembly with cap screws. Install the input shaft. When you install the bearing cap, it's important to line up the cap oil troughs with the oil holes in the clutch housing. Secure the assembly with cap screws, torquing them to 25 to 32 foot-pounds. The next step with any 1372 or 9072 model is to align the upper reverse idler gear with the case hole. Lift up on the main shaft reverse gear to achieve this alignment. Then install the idler shaft and lock ball. To continue assembly, secure the output bearing cap and gasket in place. Torque to 60 to 80 foot-pounds. The opening of the speedometer-driven gear goes toward the bottom of the case. Next, assemble the countershaft bearing caps and reverse idler plates using a gasket eliminator sealant. Make sure the bearing caps line up with the oil ports in the transmission case. Torque the cap screws to 25 to 32 foot-pounds. If an end yoke is to be installed, do so at this time. Torque to 550 to 600 foot-pounds. Make sure all forks are in neutral. Then reinstall the shifter housing with a gasket or a gasket eliminator sealant. Tighten the cap screws to 25 to 32 foot-pounds. Finally, bench shift the transmission to make sure it is working properly. That completes the teardown and reassembly of the Spicer 1372 and 9072 transmissions.